Shreveport, Louisiana sits between the Cross Lake and the Red River in northern Louisiana. It is home to riverboat and hotel casinos, science and historical museums, art galleries, and a variety of entertainment choices. Though I had never visited Shreveport, it felt as if the city were dear to me in a way that I could not explain. I had heard its name many, many times on the recordings of William Branham throughout the years, and had often browsed photos of Shreveport attractions that I intended to visit one day. Shreveport, Louisiana is the location chosen to print William Branham's The Voice of Healing publication. When Branham first began publishing the newsletter, he did so from Shreveport. Shreveport was the city chosen for several key sermons in the message. Often new doctrines, new ideas, and promotions originated from Shreveport. This should come as no surprise since Jack Moore, the pastor of Life Tabernacle and a fundamental part of Branham's campaign team, was in Shreveport, Louisiana. At the time Branham created the early versions of his stage persona, Shreveport would have looked much different than it does today. The differences are not just from an architectural standpoint, but also from a historical one. Like Louisville, Kentucky, Shreveport, Louisiana has a fascinating history, and some of that history was made during the battle for civil rights. Whether directly or indirectly, some of those historical events came as a result of William Branham and the men working with him. I never knew most of this history until long after leaving the message. I never knew just how significant Shreveport was to the message. In the same way, I never knew how significant Shreveport was to the civil rights movement. When I first moved back to Jeffersonville, a message believer told me how they attended Branham's meetings in Shreveport. They said, "I saw God on the platform. Jesus Christ himself returned to earth through William Branham. A man could not have done the things that we witnessed," he said. "That was not a man, that was God in a man." For William Branham and his history, I slowly began to realize that Shreveport was not just significant because of the advertising and the sermons. There were other aspects of Shreveport to consider. Many pathways converge at Shreveport. Pathways of people who created the prophet, people who promoted the prophet, people who the prophet promoted, and people who believed the doctrines created by the prophet. Even prophecies were added to Branham's stage persona that were later linked to Shreveport in one way or another. When I learned that Shreveport was significant to the battle for civil rights, I wanted to see how that timeline fit with the prophet's timeline. In the years leading up to Jim Jones' separation from William Branham's message, the battle stage was being set. 1957 would be the last year that Jim Jones, Joseph Matson Bozay, and William Branham teamed up for the Brotherhood-Healing Crusade in Indianapolis, Indiana. For the last crusade, T.L. Osborn, Tommy Hicks, and F.F. Bosworth headlined while William Branham held daily meetings at the People's Temple event. In 1958, however, Jones began to abandon his full gospel leanings for what would eventually become an affiliation with the Disciples of Christ denomination. Now that I knew of the conflicts of interest between Branham and Jones on the issues of civil rights, it was hard not to think about Jim Jones' motivation in leaving the message. White supremacists gave race mixing labels of communist or un-American. Ironically, Jones, who was a strong civil rights supporter, began to identify as communist. William Branham, in opposition to integration, continued to label civil rights leaders communistic, and this included freedom fighters in Shreveport, Louisiana. In one breath, he would claim to support equal rights. Then in another, he would label those seeking freedom as communist or reprobate. Those in William Branham's meetings were suddenly faced with a flurry of communist labels. Martin Luther King Jr. was communist. White children in school advocating for equal opportunity were communists. White men who married a quote-unquote colored girl was communist. Though William Branham had not yet publicly identified with Roy E. Davis and the third wave of the Ku Klux Klan, he was saying exactly what Roy Davis and other white supremacists wanted him to say. Due to the scars earned during the 1920s when William D. Upshaw helped the Ku Klux Klan narrowly escape extinction, the KKK and other white supremacy groups faced heavy scrutiny by the United States government. This scrutiny dramatically increased as the battle for civil rights grew heated, and hate crimes were committed all across the South. The Klan's power of persuasion was limited to drumming up support under concealment. William Branham, however, did not face such scrutiny. Anything said during a sermon, no matter how many people were persuaded, was protected under the law of freedom of speech. Branham spoke out against civil rights, at least from a public appearance, did so without the watchful eye of the United States government getting involved. Though the question could be raised about Branham's tax investigation, since the United States government had in the past used tax law to circumvent problems making criminal charges stick. When William Branham spoke, he spoke before large audiences, unsuspecting crowds, many unaware that political agenda had entered religious context, began associating Branham's anti-civil rights views with religion. Others, who only attended sermons in which Branham avoided those views or spoke the opposite, would have never known that William Branham had any political agenda. The nation was primed for the Klan's third pull towards white power. In July 1958, in Knoxville, Tennessee, the National States Rights Party was born. It was the result of the merger of the United White Party and the States Rights Party. Though it was formed in Knoxville, its headquarters and mailing address was in Jeffersonville, Indiana, William Branham's small hometown of less than 4,000 people. The NSRP produced the Thunderbolt publication, a white supremacy newspaper used for spreading anti-integration propaganda. The NSRP sought out to become a new political party that was a rival to the Democratic and Republican parties. It claimed that the major political parties had betrayed white Christian civilization. I was surprised the first time that I stumbled onto the archives of the publication. Many of William Branham's statements from sermons that I remembered could be found in those articles. Like Branham, the Thunderbolt spoke violently against interracial marriage. Like Branham, it violently opposed Martin Luther King Jr. and blamed King for the violence rather than blaming the terroristic supremacy groups or individuals supporting them. I could almost hear the prophet's voice as I read it. Martin Luther King would lead his people to a massacre. Democrat and Republican parties are filthy. The quote-unquote colored people seeking freedom were communistic. The colored people have better schools. What difference does it make anyhow? But as many times as we heard those sermons, every Wednesday evening, twice on Sunday, and often in between, we never caught it. It was difficult to catch, for almost in the same breath that he blasted those seeking freedom and desegregation of public schools, William Branham claimed to support integration. We had completely overlooked the political agenda. In 1960, all the white supremacy groups united against the Kennedy-Johnson presidential campaign. Roy Davis wrote letters to the Dallas Morning News, stirring up white supremacists to vote against John F. Kennedy. The National States Rights Party published articles and staged protests against Kennedy. Kennedy supported civil rights and was a threat to their very existence. In November of 1960, William Branham introduced a claim that he had a 1933 prophecy concerning women voting, though he had never mentioned this prophecy before. According to the new edition in his lineup of quote-unquote 1933 prophecies, Branham claimed that by allowing women to vote, Americans would cause the destruction of the United States. His sermon, Condemnation by Representation, was the first time this prophecy was mentioned, and it slowly became integrated into his 7 prophecies he claimed to have had in 1933. Interestingly, 1960 was also the year that William Branham introduced a converted gangster into the stage act, a killer now Christian who followed him around the country, hitchhiking to attend meetings around the United States. The next year, white supremacy groups declared all-out war against John F. Kennedy. Roy Davis opened Klan membership drives in Shreveport, the former city of Branham's campaign headquarters. Davis claimed that his objective was for states' rights, a nod to the NSRP and their intentions. In what would become a nationally publicized event, Davis posed in the Ku Klux Klan uniform for all to see. Reporters claimed that Shreveport was a favorite visiting spot for the nation's top Klan man, and publicly named Roy E. Davis as the National Imperial Wizard of the original Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. According to the newspapers, the Ku Klux Klan had been targeting Shreveport and northern Louisiana for several months, and Davis was preparing for war. Davis said, "A hot war for white supremacy is inevitable. Negroes are turning the white man's government into a mongrel government." I couldn't help but think about William Branham himself making the same claim. Branham said, "One of the greatest mistakes that the colored race ever made was down in Louisiana over there when they voted for Kennedy the other night, put him in." While Davis was targeting northern Louisiana with his clandestine membership drives, William Branham targeted the same area using public speeches in the form of sermons and distributed audio recordings. To further gain publicity, Davis invited reporters to the membership drives and used Branham's slogan in flyers posted throughout the city: "Yesterday, today, and forever." The battle intensified as crosses were burned in the front lawns of the opposition. Davis was arrested, fingerprinted, and questioned. But this was only the beginning of war. There were far bigger battles to come. In the same sermon that William Branham announced his new women's vote prophecy and began to focus his political agenda against John F. Kennedy during the time of Roy E. Davis's Klan membership drive in Shreveport, William Branham announced that he too was heading to Shreveport, Louisiana. He was still promoting Roy Davis, at home and across the nation, with public nods to him in his sermons, but now he was heading right to the battlefield in Shreveport, Louisiana. I had heard Branham's slave story many, many times, but without the historical context, I never noticed the political motivation. He said, "They should realize their position, not fussing, fighting." Then he began to associate that directive to slavery. He said, "They don't realize that a son and daughter of God should act like a son and daughter of God. They should realize their position, not fussing, fighting, stewing, carrying on, and grudges." I had never noticed how this story could be used as a political strategy. I knew very little about the political landscape of the time. I heard what he wanted white males to hear. But what did the African Americans in the heat of this battle hear? Did they try to, quote-unquote, realize their position? Or were African Americans offended by the many things that I never caught William Branham saying in his sermons?